There is a quiet, almost imperceptible shift that happens when an empath reaches their breaking point. For years, they have operated as the emotional anchors for others, absorbing pain, mediating conflict, and extending patience where none was returned. They've been the healers, the forgivers, the ones who give second, third, and fourth chances. But beneath that softness lies something ancient, powerful, and often overlooked, the shadow self. It is the part of the empath that has been repressed, denied, or hidden in order to maintain harmony. It waits silently in the background, watching, learning, and growing stronger each time the empath swallows their truth to keep the peace. And when that shadow finally awakens, it changes everything. The shadow self is not darkness in the way most people understand it. It is not cruelty, malice, or evil. Instead, it represents the parts of the self that were rejected to fit into societal or relational expectations. For empaths, this often means their anger, assertiveness, boundaries, and capacity for self-protection. As children, many empaths were conditioned to believe that love had to be earned through self-sacrifice. They learned that expressing their own needs could bring conflict, withdrawal, or punishment. So they adapted by becoming overly agreeable, nurturing, and accommodating. Over time, this pattern forms a split. The outward self becomes the giver, while the inner self, the shadow, holds all the unexpressed truths and unmet needs. Life, however, has a way of pushing even the most patient souls into transformation. Repeated betrayals, manipulations, and emotional exploitation act like chisels, slowly cracking the protective mask the empath wears. Every time they are taken for granted, the shadow stirs. Every moment they suppress their intuition to avoid confrontation, the shadow sharpens its edges. And eventually, there comes a moment when the empath can no longer contain what has been buried. That moment is not explosive at first, it's awakening. It's the realization that the kind, forgiving version of themselves has been weaponized against them, and they can no longer allow it. When the shadow awakens, the empath begins to see with brutal clarity. They start noticing patterns they once ignored, lies they once explained away, and manipulative tactics they used to rationalize. Their perception deepens. It's as if a veil is lifted, and they can finally see people's true intentions without emotional filters. This clarity is often unsettling at first because it challenges everything they've believed about love, loyalty, and goodness. But it's also empowering. The shadow doesn't just expose external deception, it shines a light on the empath's own self-betrayal. It forces them to confront the ways they have allowed their boundaries to be crossed, their voices silenced, and their worth diminished. This confrontation is where transformation begins. The empath realizes that their shadow is not their enemy, it's their ally. It carries the fierce, unapologetic parts of their identity that they've been too afraid to embody. The shadow whispers truths like, "You deserve respect," "Your needs matter," and "Stop making excuses for other people's cruelty." These are not new truths. They are truths that have been waiting, locked away, for the empath to be ready to hear them. And when the empath finally listens, they stop bending themselves into emotional shapes to make others comfortable. They stop rescuing people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions. They stop dimming their light to soothe fragile egos. As the shadow integrates into their conscious identity, the empath's energy shifts. They are no longer the soft target for emotional predators. Their kindness becomes discerning rather than blind. Their generosity comes with boundaries rather than guilt. Their forgiveness transforms from endless tolerance into measured grace. This shift confuses and unsettles those who once depended on the empath's compliance. Narcissists, manipulators, and users sense the change instinctively. They feel the empath's newfound power, even if it's not spoken aloud. The same person who once absorbed their chaos without resistance is now a mirror that reflects their behavior back at them with unsettling accuracy. This awakening does not turn the empath into someone they are not. Rather, it allows them to become whole. They embrace the totality of their being, the nurturing and the fierce, the soft and the strong, the forgiving and the discerning. They understand that true compassion includes self-compassion, and real love does not require self-erasure. They begin to walk through the world with a quiet authority, a presence that no longer seeks approval but commands respect. The shadow, once hidden and silent, becomes a guiding force, reminding them that empathy without boundaries leads to self-destruction, but empathy fused with power becomes a force that few can manipulate. This awakening is irreversible. Once the empath has seen the truth, they cannot unsee it. Once they've reclaimed their shadow, they cannot return to who they were before. They have stepped into a new level of self-awareness that changes the dynamics of every relationship they have. People who thrived on their compliance may become uncomfortable. Those who respected them all along will admire their strength, and within the empath, a deep calm begins to take root. The calm of someone who has finally stopped abandoning themselves, who has finally allowed their shadow to stand beside their light, not as an enemy, but as a protector. For most empaths, boundaries begin as soft lines drawn in sand, easily shifted, easily erased, especially when faced with the emotional needs of others. They are natural givers, often raised to believe that love means self-sacrifice, that kindness means saying yes even when every part of their soul screams no. Their instinct is to keep peace, not provoke conflict, and in doing so, they unconsciously allow others to step past their limits. This generosity can look noble from the outside, but over time, it drains them. Each ignored boundary leaves a small wound, and those wounds accumulate quietly until something inside finally refuses to tolerate it anymore. At that point, their boundaries no longer function as polite requests. They harden into armor. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It begins with exhaustion, a deep, soul-level fatigue that comes from constantly giving without receiving equal respect in return. Empaths are often surrounded by people who take their kindness for granted, friends who call only when they need emotional support, partners who rely on their patience but rarely offer the same, family members who expect endless understanding but give little in return. At first, the empath rationalizes this imbalance. They tell themselves they're just going through something, or they'll change eventually. But the pattern doesn't change, it deepens. And eventually, the empath starts to recognize that their open door policy has become an invitation for others to exploit their compassion. The moment of realization is pivotal. It's not dramatic, it's usually quiet, born in moments of solitude when the empath reflects on how much of themselves they've given away. They see the late night conversations where they listened for hours but had no one to turn to. They recall the times they forgave behavior that should never have been normalized. They notice how their energy has been slowly siphoned by people who rarely, if ever, pour anything back in. This clarity acts like heat on soft metal. The boundaries that once spent so easily begin to solidify. The empath realizes that kindness without limits is not noble. It's self-erasure. As boundaries turn into armor, the empath's demeanor shifts. They start saying no without over-explaining. They stop feeling guilty for prioritizing their peace. They no longer allow manipulation to be disguised as love. Where they once tolerated subtle disrespect, they now recognize it immediately and address it with quiet firmness. This isn't an act of revenge, it's self-preservation. The empath finally understands that healthy boundaries are not walls that keep love out, but shields that keep toxicity from bleeding in. And this understanding transforms how they show up in every interaction. People who were accustomed to their endless tolerance often respond with shock when this shift happens. A narcissist who once thrived on pushing their limits suddenly finds those limits immovable. A manipulative friend who used guilt as a weapon discovers that the empath no longer flinches. A family member who relied on emotional blackmail is met with calm detachment instead of desperate appeasement. The empath's new boundaries confuse those who benefited from their lack of them. And in that confusion, the power dynamic changes. The empath is no longer a passive participant in others' stories. They become the author of their own. These new boundaries are not loud or aggressive. They're steady, unshakable, and backed by self-respect. The empath doesn't need to defend them constantly because the energy they emit communicates clearly. This is who I am now, and this is what I will no longer allow. It's a quiet strength, and it's far more intimidating to manipulators than anger ever was. Anger can be negotiated, argued with, or provoked into chaos. Boundaries, once turned into armor, cannot. They are not emotional reactions, they are structural reinforcements. The empath also begins to experience a profound internal shift. For the first time, they feel safe inside themselves. They no longer carry the anxiety of constantly being stretched too thin. Their energy, once scattered in 100 directions, trying to hold everyone together, starts to consolidate. This consolidation brings clarity. They can now distinguish between genuine connections and parasitic attachments. They can tell the difference between someone who values their presence and someone who values their utility. This discernment is a byproduct of armored boundaries, and it acts like a filter, naturally removing toxic dynamics from their lives. Interestingly, the empath's relationships also deepen in quality once these boundaries are in place. People who genuinely care for them respect these limits and adjust accordingly. Healthy individuals are not threatened by boundaries, they are drawn to them. Boundaries create mutual respect, and mutual respect creates emotional safety. For the empath, who has often lived in relationships defined by imbalance, this shift feels both liberating and unfamiliar. They begin to attract people who match their energy rather than drain it, and they start to experience what true reciprocity feels like. What makes these boundaries so powerful is that they are born from pain, self-reflection, and hard-earned wisdom. They are not theoretical concepts. They are forged through lived experience. Each time the empath ignored their intuition, each time they allowed disrespect to slide, each time they prioritized someone else's comfort over their own truth, they were gathering the raw material that would eventually become this armor. And when that armor is finally in place, it doesn't just protect them from others, it reminds them daily of their worth. It becomes a living statement that their energy, time, and heart are valuable, and not everyone deserves unlimited access to them. Strategic emotional detachment is not coldness, nor is it a lack of empathy. It is the deliberate, conscious decision to no longer allow one's emotions to be a weapon that others can use against them. For empaths, this shift is monumental because their natural state is one of emotional openness. They feel deeply, care intensely, and often absorb the emotional atmosphere around them like a sponge. This openness, while beautiful, has also made them easy targets for those who thrive on control and manipulation. Narcissists, emotional predators, and chronic takers instinctively sense the empath's sensitivity and exploit it, knowing that guilt, fear, and emotional obligation are powerful levers. Strategic emotional detachment emerges when the empath finally understands this dynamic and decides to stop playing the game on someone else's terms. For years, the empath's emotional responsiveness has been both their gift and their trap. When someone is angry, they feel responsible for calming them. When someone is sad, they feel obligated to fix it. When someone is disappointed, they immediately wonder what they did wrong. This automatic emotional mirroring gives manipulators immense power. They don't need to control the empath directly. They only need to control the emotional environment, and the empath will adjust themselves accordingly. This is why strategic detachment is not about shutting down feelings. It's about reclaiming control of where those feelings are directed and how they are used. The process often begins after a series of painful realizations. The empath notices that no matter how much emotional effort they invest, some people never change their behavior. They see that their empathy has been used as a leash, keeping them in cycles of guilt and self-blame. They recognize that their emotional reactions have become predictable patterns that others can manipulate at will. These realizations sting, but they are crucial. They force the empath to look at their emotional landscape not just as a source of connection, but also as a potential point of vulnerability. And with this clarity, a subtle but profound shift occurs. They stop reacting automatically. Strategic detachment requires self-awareness. The empath learns to observe their emotions in real time, almost like a witness watching their own internal reactions from a slight distance. When someone tries to guilt trip them, instead of instantly feeling guilt, they pause. They examine the situation logically. Is this guilt truly mine, or is it being projected onto me? When someone tries to provoke an emotional reaction, they notice the attempt rather than falling into the trap. This pause is everything. It breaks the manipulative rhythm that narcissists rely on. Emotional predators thrive on fast, instinctive responses. They falter when the empath responds slowly, thoughtfully, and strategically. As this new habit develops, manipulators begin to lose their grip. The empath no longer jumps to defend themselves at every accusation. They no longer over-explain, trying to prove their innocence or worth. They stop absorbing emotional chaos that isn't theirs to carry. Instead, they remain calm, centered, and observant. This calmness is unnerving to narcissists because their entire power structure depends on emotional control. When the empath refuses to be emotionally hijacked, the manipulator is left without leverage. Their tactics, rage, guilt, silent treatment, triangulation, start to fall flat against a wall of composed detachment, Strategic detachment is also about energy preservation. The empath begins to understand that not every conflict deserves their emotional investment, not every misunderstanding needs immediate resolution, and not every person merits deep emotional engagement. This doesn't mean they become indifferent, it means they become selective. They choose where to place their emotional energy with intention, focusing on people and situations that reciprocate and respect their efforts. This selectiveness is often mistaken for coldness by those who once fed off their emotional availability, but in reality, it's a form of self-respect. Another powerful element of strategic detachment is the ability to maintain composure in the face of emotional manipulation. Narcissists often escalate when their usual tactics stop working. They may become more dramatic, more aggressive, or more pitiable, hoping to trigger the empath's old patterns. But a strategically detached empath doesn't meet drama with drama. They observe it like watching a play unfold, recognizing each tactic for what it is. Their calmness acts like a mirror, reflecting the manipulator's behavior back at them without absorbing it. This mirror effect is deeply unsettling to those who rely on emotional chaos to maintain control. Over time, this detachment rewires how the empath experiences relationships. Instead of being constantly on emotional defense, they become deliberate about their responses. They stop feeling the need to justify every boundary or explain every decision. They no longer fear disapproval as they once did because their sense of self-worth is no longer tied to how others react. This internal shift is subtle but immensely powerful. It's the moment when the empath moves from being a reactor to being a strategist. Strategic emotional detachment also allows the empath to see people's true intentions more clearly. When they're no longer clouded by guilt, fear, or obligation, they can observe behavior without distortion. They notice patterns, inconsistencies, and manipulative tactics with sharper perception. They become less emotionally entangled and more discerning. This clarity doesn't make them cynical, it makes them wise. They can still offer kindness and compassion, but now it comes with discernment and choice, not compulsion. Ultimately, this kind of detachment is not about becoming heartless. It's about becoming powerful. It's the empath realizing that their emotions are precious resources, not tools for others to exploit. It's the decision to step out of emotional chess games and instead set the terms of engagement. And when this happens, the dynamics in their relationships transform dramatically. Emotional manipulators lose their control, toxic cycles weaken, and the empath steps into a place of quiet, steady strength that cannot be easily shaken. Authenticity as a weapon may sound paradoxical, but for empaths who have spent years being misunderstood, underestimated, or manipulated, truth becomes their sharpest blade. Authenticity isn't about being brutally honest for the sake of it, nor is it about proving a point. It is about standing so firmly in one's truth that illusions, manipulation, and false narratives can no longer survive in its presence. For empaths, this transformation marks a profound shift from passive understanding to active clarity. They stop playing roles designed to keep others comfortable and start embodying the raw, unfiltered version of themselves. This shift is powerful because narcissists and manipulators thrive on confusion, emotional fog, and distorted realities. When the empath becomes deeply authentic, that fog dissipates, and the narcissist loses one of their most powerful weapons, control through distortion. For much of their lives, Empaths often shape their identities around the needs and expectations of others. They soften their language to avoid hurting feelings. They suppress their boundaries to avoid confrontation. They agree to things they don't truly support to maintain harmony. This self-editing creates a subtle but dangerous pattern. Their truth becomes negotiable. Narcissists sense this flexibility and exploit it, constantly pushing to see how much the empath will bend. The empath, driven by the desire to keep peace, often bends far beyond what is healthy. Over time, this creates resentment, confusion, and a painful disconnect from their own sense of self. Authenticity shatters this pattern the moment the empath decides to stop hiding their truth for someone else's comfort. When an empath starts speaking and acting authentically, their words carry a different weight. They are no longer diluted with fear, guilt, or the desperate need to be understood. They become clear, grounded, and firm. Manipulators rely on ambiguity. They twist words, create misunderstandings, and use emotional pressure to control narratives. Authentic communication leaves little room for these tactics to thrive. A narcissist's favorite tool is to create a false version of reality and then gaslight others into believing it. But when an empath calmly, consistently, and clearly speaks their truth, that false reality crumbles. Authenticity exposes deception not by shouting, but by shining a light so bright that shadows have nowhere to hide. This authenticity also dismantles one of the narcissist's primary defenses, their need to project a false self. Narcissists operate by constructing a grandiose mask, an image of perfection, superiority, or victimhood that they need others to accept. Most people, especially empaths, unconsciously play along with this mask to avoid conflict. They nod, they tolerate, they pretend not to see the cracks. But an authentic empath doesn't feed the illusion. They observe, they acknowledge, and they speak what they see without malice, but with precision. This is deeply unsettling to narcissists because their power depends on collective silence and compliance. One person's authenticity can unravel an entire web of deception. Authenticity as a weapon is not loud or aggressive. It is quiet, unwavering, and deeply rooted in self-awareness. The empath no longer needs to over-explain or justify their perspective. They simply state their truth and let it stand on its own. This unnerves manipulators because they are used to controlling conversations through emotional push and pull. They expect the empath to backpedal, soften, or doubt themselves. Instead, they are met with clarity that doesn't move, doesn't apologize for existing, and doesn't shrink to fit someone else's narrative. This kind of authenticity is like emotional sunlight. It reveals everything, whether people like it or not. For the empath, embracing authenticity is also a deeply healing act. After years of suppressing their voice, they finally allow themselves to be seen and heard fully. They stop wearing emotional masks to protect others from discomfort. They stop hiding their boundaries behind vague language. They stop cushioning the truth to make it palatable. This self-acceptance brings a new sense of power. They realize that their voice doesn't need to be loud to be strong. It simply needs to be real. Authenticity becomes both shield and sword, protecting them from manipulation while also piercing through deception with effortless clarity. Narcissists often respond to this newfound authenticity with defensiveness or hostility. They may double down on gaslighting, attempt character assassination, or try to provoke emotional reactions. But authenticity thrives in calmness. The empath doesn't need to match aggression with aggression. They hold their ground without flinching, and in doing so, they deny the narcissist the emotional chaos they rely on. This is why authenticity is such a powerful weapon. It doesn't fight fire with fire. It removes the oxygen that fuels the fire in the first place. Manipulation can't survive in a space where truth is spoken calmly and consistently. Authenticity also disrupts the empath's old patterns of people pleasing. In the past, they may have felt responsible for other people's emotions, constantly modifying their behavior to avoid upsetting anyone. But living authentically means accepting that other people's reactions are not their responsibility. If someone is offended by their truth, that is not their burden to carry. This shift is liberating. It allows the empath to interact with others from a place of self-respect rather than fear. Their authenticity draws clear lines in relationships, revealing who respects their truth and who only valued their compliance. In relationships, this authenticity acts like a filter. Those who thrive on honesty, growth, and mutual respect are drawn closer. Those who rely on control, manipulation, or fantasy begin to distance themselves because they can no longer operate comfortably in the presence of someone who refuses to play along. The empath starts to see who truly belongs in their inner circle, not based on emotional obligation, but based on mutual truth. This naturally strengthens their sense of identity and self-trust. They no longer second-guess themselves every time someone disagrees with them. They no longer silence their intuition to keep others happy. They no longer hide their real thoughts out of fear of rejection. Authenticity, when fully embraced, becomes one of the empath's most formidable tools. It doesn't require force. It requires courage. It's the courage to stand in one's truth, even when it's inconvenient, to speak clearly, even when others would prefer silence, and to refuse to participate in dynamics built on illusions. It is through this courage that empaths transform from passive healers into powerful truth, tellers who can no longer be easily manipulated or controlled. Controlled rage is one of the most misunderstood, yet transformative forces an empath can tap into. For much of their lives, empaths are taught, implicitly or explicitly, that anger is dangerous, shameful, or unspiritual. They grow up believing that expressing rage makes them bad people, that staying calm and forgiving is the only virtuous path. So they suppress it. They bury their anger under layers of patience, empathy, and self-sacrifice. They convince themselves that tolerance is strength. But what they don't realize is that suppressed rage doesn't disappear. It simmers beneath the surface, waiting for acknowledgement, and when that rage is finally brought into conscious awareness, not as chaotic fury, but as focused energy, it becomes a source of incredible power. For empaths, anger has often been associated with trauma. Many have experienced environments where expressing anger led to conflict, abandonment, or punishment. To survive, they learn to internalize it. Over time, this suppression created emotional bottlenecks, places within where every betrayal, every dismissal, every manipulation piled up like steam in a sealed container. They learn to smile through disrespect, to rationalize cruelty, and to forgive people who had no interest in changing. Each act of self-betrayal added pressure to that container. Eventually, the rage inside grows too intense to ignore, and the empath faces a crucial choice. Either it explodes uncontrollably, harming both themselves and others, or it is channeled deliberately and strategically into controlled power, Controlled rage is not about losing control. It is about reclaiming it. It begins with the empath finally giving themselves permission to feel anger without shame. They stop labeling their rage as wrong or ugly and start recognizing it as a natural human response to injustice, disrespect, or boundary violations. This is often an uncomfortable process because it forces them to confront emotions they've long buried. But once the empath faces their rage honestly, something extraordinary happens. The chaotic energy begins to stabilize. Instead of a storm that destroys indiscriminately, it becomes a fire that can be directed with precision. This controlled rage manifests as an unshakable clarity. When an empath reaches this state, they stop making excuses for other people's behavior. They stop minimizing their own pain to protect someone else's ego. They stop tolerating cycles of manipulation simply because they're afraid of conflict. Their rage, now under conscious control, acts like a spotlight that illuminates every injustice they previously ignored. It doesn't cloud their judgment, it sharpens it. They see clearly where boundaries have been crossed, where they've been taken for granted, and where their kindness has been exploited. This clarity becomes the foundation upon which decisive action is built. Another key aspect of controlled rage is the calm exterior that often accompanies it. To the outside world, the empath may appear unusually composed, even serene. But beneath that calm lies a focused intensity that others can feel instinctively. Narcissists and manipulators who once toyed with their emotions suddenly sense that something has changed. The empath no longer reacts with hurt or confusion. They respond with deliberate precision. There's a firmness in their tone, a steadiness in their gaze, and a finality in their decisions that leaves manipulators unsettled. This quiet fury is far more powerful than loud outbursts because it cannot be easily dismissed as irrational or emotional. It is measured, strategic, and unyielding. Controlled rage also fuels the courage to make difficult choices. Many empaths stay in unhealthy situations far longer than they should because they fear hurting others, causing conflict, or being judged. But when their rage is no longer suppressed, it gives them the strength to do what they once thought impossible. They end toxic relationships not out of spite, but out of self-respect. They walk away from manipulative dynamics without offering endless explanations. They confront issues head on instead of tiptoeing around them. This is not rage destroying their lives. It is rage liberating them from lives that were slowly destroying their spirit. This kind of rage also disrupts the manipulative power structures narcissists rely on. Narcissists thrive on emotional control. They push buttons to provoke reactions, feeding off the empath's confusion or guilt. But controlled rage removes those buttons entirely. When an empath is operating from a place of calm, focused anger, they are no longer emotionally predictable. Manipulators can then no longer guilt them into submission or provoke them into emotional outbursts. The empath stops reacting and starts acting, making choices from a position of strength rather than emotional reactivity. This shift destabilizes narcissistic control because their usual tactics simply stop working. Controlled rage doesn't manifest as cruelty or revenge. Instead, it manifests as decisive action, firm boundaries, and unwavering self-respect. It looks like the empath saying no without apology. It looks like them cutting off access to their energy from those who abuse it. It looks like walking away from situations that no longer align with their values without seeking anyone's approval. It's not loud, but it is absolute. This kind of power doesn't need to announce itself. It radiates from the empath's presence, and others can feel it even if it's never spoken aloud. This transformation often surprises those who have underestimated the empath. They were used to someone endlessly forgiving, accommodating, and patient. They mistook gentleness for weakness. But controlled rage reveals a side of the empath that few ever see, the part that will no longer tolerate disrespect in any form. It is the moment when the empath steps fully into their own power, not by abandoning their empathy, but by fusing it with strength. Their kindness remains, but it is now protected by fire. Their compassion stays, but it is no longer available to those who exploit it. Their silence, once passive, becomes purposeful and heavy with meaning. Controlled rage is transformative because it integrates two forces that were previously separated, empathy and power. When empaths learn to harness their anger without fear, they become formidable. They don't lash out recklessly, and they don't collapse under pressure. They stand firmly, act decisively, and carry an inner intensity that commands respect. People who once manipulated their emotions now find themselves facing a force they cannot control. And this is the point where the empath's presence alone begins to shift dynamics, not through threats or drama, but through unwavering, focused strength that comes from embracing the power of their own controlled rage